Welcome to those who are joining us for the third panel in the Macro Energy Systems Speaker Series, which was organized by Joseph D. Carollis. The macro energy systems is an emergent field and a research community that focuses on large-scale, systems-level, long-term aspects of energy systems and their implications for other systems, including the environment, economy, and human well-being. If you are interested, please look for the Macro Energy Systems website and sign up for our email list. So let me start by introducing myself, and then we'll talk a little bit about the panel. So I am Erin Baker. I'm a professor of industrial engineering and operations research at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and the faculty director of the Energy Transition Institute, which is focused on stakeholder engaged research and education at the intersection of energy technology and social equity. So we're bringing together natural scientists and engineers with social scientists and humanities. So my connection to the topic that we're going to talk about today started in earnest when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in northern Ghana in West Africa, near the border of Burkina Faso. When I lived there, we were not on the grid, and so I did not have electricity myself. And at the same time, in the 2 years that I lived there, I could see desertification happening in that part of the world. More recently, I've been moving my research in this direction, mostly in collaboration with some former students. I have projects in West Africa with Destiny Knock at Carnegie Mellon and Franklin Cañaco at Tufts, and in Mexico with Rodrigo Mercado Fernandez, who is at Appalachian State. So in today's panel, there are two types of discussions I'm hoping we're going to have. One is practical, and is this question of how do we model energy systems, and especially how do we model deep decarbonization in developing countries well, right? How do we model it accurately and impactfully? The other aspect I'm interested in is more ethical, and it's around what questions should we be asking of our models, right? What questions should we be asking with our models? And how can the kind of modeling we do avoid exacerbating current international and international inequities, and instead kind of make the world better and more equitable? So this is the kind of thing that I'm hoping we're going to cover. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to ask a question of the panel, please use the Q&A. So at the bottom, where you'll see participants, Q&A chat. So put your questions in the Q&A. We will be looking at that, and I will be then sending those questions to the panelists. So do that. But also I encourage you to use the chat function for comments, right? To let the panelists know that there is an audience out there and get some feedback. So, like, wow, interesting point. I think it's really nice for the panelists to get a little bit of interaction. So feel free to use the chat, but if you want a question passed on to the panelists, please use the Q&A. All right, we're going to start by having each panelist introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their experience that is relevant to our topic of modeling deep decarbonization in developing countries. And so I'm going to start with handing it over to Lauren Culver, who is a senior energy specialist at the World Bank. And so Lauren, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm certain that in this conversation, you'll see I have a lot of enthusiasm for energy modeling, and particularly for energy modeling as related to countries in the developing world. So thanks so much for this opportunity. I know with macro energy systems, you obviously can be looking at a lot of important topics. So I'm particularly pleased that this one has been highlighted. Just to introduce myself, my background has been at the intersection of energy and energy modeling and policy for a number of years now. I started out in my master's work actually at MIT, looking at kind of the connections between the way modeling assumptions affect policy assumptions and how policy assumptions then affect modeling assumptions. And it was actually a really interesting situation where back in early 2000, any of the people kind of modeling renewable energy were looking at a very low base and using small linear growth to try and project how PV would grow. And so obviously model results said there's not a big role for PV to play because there were no mechanisms in the model to see it take off. And so policymakers weren't really interested in what they could do to advance the technology. And so it was really having a dialogue about how we modeled solar PV at that time really changed how policymakers thought about what could be possible. I spent some time at the US Department of Energy and the US Department of State. They're mostly working on the policy side and kind of a user and consumer of energy modeling. And there, it's really where I got an appreciation for the important role that models play in kind of the decision-making process. And it really helped me tune my understanding of what are the particular questions that different policymakers bring to a modeling analysis. And therefore, as a modeler, how could I be more cognizant of some of those important questions and basically designing my research questions and even the design and structure of the model and some of the assumptions to be able to support those particular policy assumptions. Went on to do a PhD at Stanford in the Management Science and Engineering program there, working with John Wyatt and a wonderful team of people there on a variety of energy system questions. And then I've been at the World Bank for the last several years. Started out actually in the Africa unit, working in Southern Africa and West Africa on a variety of energy issues. Not really a huge focus for me there on modeling at the time. Did some geospatial modeling work, some high VRE integration modeling work, but not really of the type of kind of models that we use in the macro energy system space. But several months ago, I moved into the global knowledge unit of the energy team at the World Bank. And there we do have a small team that's specifically thinking about decarbonization and how do we model decarbonization to better advise our client countries really around the world. So we have a couple of, we have an in-house tool that we work with, and we work with a variety of other partners and firms to try and get into this work. And really we're doing that for a number of reasons at the World Bank. One is going forward, we've committed that all of our lending should be aligned with Paris. So making sure that we aren't lending to countries for projects that are going to keep them from meeting decarbonization and emission reduction targets, but also more on the strategy side. So helping countries with their nationally determined contributions and their updates, long-term strategies. And a particular focus for the World Bank right now is something called country climate diagnostic reports. And you can Google CCDR World Bank if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But we're systematically now working country by country and trying to understand, quantitatively, what are the opportunities and risks that face different countries with not only climate change impacts, but climate change policies themselves, and how will climate change impact development. So those are really the kinds of questions we are trying to answer. Maybe just to give you a little bit more specifics on the flavor, a lot of the one category that we focus a lot on is kind of coal transition. So how can we use modeling results to inform the timing of coal phase down in countries so that countries can prepare adequately to help their communities and their workforce transition into a green economy, but also looking at the cost of stranded assets, for example. So knowing that, especially in the developing world, where I think most of the coal assets that will be stranded are in the developing world because their assets are newer and will need to be shut down on a more rapid basis. So we're trying to understand, help them estimate what those costs will be so that we can work with them on ways to offset those costs. Obviously working a lot in the renewable energy scale-up side, trying to help governments understand how quickly they would need to scale up certain technologies and what particularly that means for their policy. And really what that means for finance. Most of the investment that we see that's needed far exceeds what public budgets can afford to invest in their country. So they're really going to need to rely on private investment, which is common in a lot of the developed world, but in the developing world, there aren't necessarily the mechanisms in place to really channel in private finance into these projects. So working with them to help understand what are those finance needs, how can they use scarce public resources or scarce climate finance to try and raise enough private finance to be able to really enact the energy transition. So looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Lauren, very much. And so now I will hand it over to our next panelist, Paulina Jaramilloa. You can go ahead and introduce yourself and your experience in this
area. Thanks for organizing and inviting me. I think I don't work in things as interesting and extensive as Lauren, so my introduction will probably be shorter. I am originally from Colombia. I was in high school when the Kyoto Protocol was implemented. At that time, I thought I want to work on, I was deciding to pursue environmental engineering because I wanted to work on climate change issues. It was a new major at the local university where I'm from, and everyone kind of thought I was crazy. What was all this environmentalism? Like, you live in a country, Colombia was very violent at that time. It was a difficult time. So this idea of working and focusing on climate change was, I guess, very foreign to the world I lived in. And so I came to the US, I have 3 degrees in civil and environmental engineering and have never practiced civil or environmental engineering. I hated introduction to electrical engineering when I was an undergrad, and I do some modeling of power systems. And I look back and I think the work I'm doing on climate change and energy systems is what I thought I would be doing when I was 16, and I got here without really knowing that at the time. My interest in, so my work, I moved around. I started my PhD, I did my PhD at Carnegie Mellon University doing life cycle assessment of energy resources, particularly coal and natural gas. I then transitioned and did some work looking at renewable integration in the US power system. I continue to do work on macro energy modeling for the US. I have a project with Joe Picarlis, who was one of the organizers, I think, of the panel, looking at decarbonization pathways for the US. But over the last maybe 6-7 years, I've also expanded my research to look at decarbonization in developing countries. I've done some work. I had a student from Brazil, and so he did some work on looking at Amazonian hydropower and options for replacing Amazonian hydropower. And most recently, we've been doing a lot in East Africa. CMU has a campus in Rwanda. We have the CMU Africa program. I spent a year in Rwanda. I had never been to Africa when I started doing work on Africa. So I spent a year with my family there to really understand the context. And the reason I'm focused, there's a lot of energy work happening on China and India. The reason I'm interested in Africa in particular is that we have a dual challenge of meeting the energy needs of 1 billion people. 600 million people lack access to electricity and modern cooking services. So when we talk about decarbonization in the context of Africa, we're talking about avoiding new emissions. It's not reducing emissions. Their emissions are already pretty low, but it's avoiding new emissions and simultaneously meet this massive need for energy. And so that's the motivation for my work.
All right, thank you very much. And I forgot to mention Paulina's title. She's Professor of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Sorry, Paulina. And so then I'll introduce the third panelist. So that's Haewon McJeon, Senior Economist at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which is associated with PNNL. Haewon.
Thanks. Sorry, I brought slides. I didn't know we were going to mostly talk, but I'll go through it pretty quick, I promise. I'm Haewon McJeon, jointly appointed at Pacific Northwest National Lab, as well as University of Maryland. And we do lots of modeling for decarbonizations. This is one paper we recently did. This really shows the type of modeling we do. We do global modeling. On the left chart, we're showing where the emissions are headed with the Glasgow pledges. And then we marry that with the Earth system model, a simple climate model, to measure where we would end up in terms of temperature. And the upshot is that if we do nothing, we're going to end up at 3-4 degree world. But with all the pledges, the new pledges coming in, we're tipping the scale towards 2 degrees, under 2 degrees, but we're still far away from 1.5 degrees. That's really the upshot. Under the hood, what we do in terms of modeling is this model that we have, global change analysis model, has 32 major regions, energy economy regions, 300 odd land regions, and 200 odd water basins. And we link up the energy system with the land system with the water system. And then together we estimate the emissions that's coming out of it. And then on the climate side, we measure the temperature, sea level rise, and whatnot. So we try to model all of different greenhouse gases and where we will likely end up after doing all the emissions mitigation. And for the work we did to measure the temperature, what we looked at is simplified 32 region model. We're looking at the countries that have emissions growing over time, and this is the under new policy, the emissions would grow over time. But with the pledged scenarios in terms of net zero pledges, as well as 2030 targets, if you add them all up, where are we going to end up globally? And then we have this emission mitigation wedge that's coming in here. And then you see the US, EU, and China going to net zero. And most recently, India announced that they will go to net zero in 2070. So adding those all up together, you get to a certain temperature outcome. And then every year when we measure it, it goes lower and lower, and that's the optimistic use. Optimistic use. And then going deeper underneath it, we do much more because we're national lab for US. We do much more work in terms of US analysis, how US can reduce emissions. And this is a typical story for any deep decarbonization modeling. We need to transform the energy system to get to net zero, energy efficiency, decarbonization in electricity, and using that decarbonized electricity to feed the end use sectors, including electricity, hydrogen, and other low carbon fuels. That's not enough. We need to squeeze out all the non-CO2 gases associated with it and take advantage of as much land sink that's available and sustainable, as well as engineered CO2 removal technologies. Adding them all up together, we can get to net zero. Now, but we have the 32 region model, and we've been working closely with other countries, and clearly lacking is that we're not really having a lot of partnership and enough research into Africa. But it's an open source model, so we're hoping to recruit as much partners as possible to help better understand how globally we can go to a net zero and deep decarbonization or 1.5 degree future. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And so now I think we're going to spotlight the three panelists and start asking some questions. And so the first question is really what this panel was kind of titled as. What is the most important difference to keep in mind when modeling macro energy systems, and especially deep decarbonization, in developing countries as opposed to kind of in the US and the more developed countries? And so maybe I'll start with Haewon. and then go to Lauren and Paulina, and then we'll kind of change the order as we go. So Haewon, do you have a thought of kind of what, for you, what's the most important difference you've come up with?
Yeah, this is after being invited to this speaker series, been thinking a lot about this space. And as we do more modeling of deep decarbonization and net zero, we're realizing that net zero emission modeling it is really hard to do. But modeling net zero emissions in developing countries is really, really hard to do. And the first thing that comes to mind is the incomplete data. Data is so much harder to get. And specifically, less on the energy side. Energy side, sometimes we have pretty good data, but once you go to agriculture, forestry, and land use, or non-CO2 emissions, CH4 emissions from oil and gas, HFC emissions from heating and cooling, those become a big deal because they have so much less CO2 emissions from energy sector, but data is so sparse. So getting the data together is really the first, like half the work goes into this is that just getting the historical data right. And that's so much that work that goes in. And so that's one of the difficulties there. And then once you get the historical data lined up, going forward, I think it's different from developed countries where we focus a lot on phasing out coal, gas, and oil, phase out, phase down, either way. But for developing countries, it's a lot more about avoiding lock-in. It's less about, reducing what small amount we have and reducing, phasing out and phasing down, but it's more of a, don't get locked into coal, don't get locked into oil, don't get locked into gas. So at least you maintain a lower level of emissions. And finally, are we going to bring emissions to just net zero emissions, or is it going to be an unjust net zero emissions? This just transition and equity issue is becoming so much more important, but it's much harder for developing countries, especially when we model it, is because they have so much more fragile institutions to support just transitions, and the existing injustice is a lot more prevalent. So we have to, as a modeler, we have to be mindful that we're not exacerbating this injustice when we develop the net zero scenarios. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So Lauren, what are kind of your thoughts about the most important differences to keep in mind?
Thank you. The first point I would want to make of what the big difference is there's just not a lot of modeling out there. It's not what attracts young grad students and others to work. I mean, part of it is the data issue. Part of it is that, models may already be parameterized when you come in to do your work. And so there's kind of inertia to continue looking into the countries that have always been looked into. And in fairness, because of the strong links between economic growth and energy consumption, a lot of the emissions are coming from most of the developing countries or developed countries. But I think the major difference is just that there aren't necessarily modelers out there that are committed to wading through the data problems. I won't admit that there aren't data problems, but really just persevering through that and seeing what can be modeled in a meaningful way to kind of inform the choices and options that countries face. So that would be my first point of what the difference is. And the second, it kind of touches on what Haewon has said and connects something to something Paulina mentioned earlier. And that's just the nature of the economic growth in a lot of the developing countries that we're looking at. When we're talking about deep decarbonization, you're not just trying to drain the emissions out of existing industries and think about how to do that. You're having to guess what kind of industries are going to be competitive to develop in that country, that can compete globally, that, make sense for, the resources of an individual country. And, it's impossible to look decades in the future and think about what industry is going to be created in a country to drive economic growth, and therefore what is the low carbon or zero carbon way forward for that industry. So certainly there's some low hanging fruit on decarbonizing the power sector, but there's so much of what drives our economy and prosperity in the developed world that's based on, what are the hard to abate sectors in the developed world, and the developing world is having to, to think about that upside down, and that's particularly, I think, hard when you're trying to model the future of something coming into existence that doesn't exist, rather than just changing the character of what's there.
All right, thank you. Paulina, what do you see as kind of key difference we need to keep in mind?
So I think the key differences are really differences in the challenges of doing the modeling. I think the modeling itself, the frameworks for modeling are not different. I submitted a proposal to a federal funding agency to look at decarbonization pathways in East Africa. And one of the reviewers gave us a bad review because we used an open source optimization model as the framework. We were proposing to use an optimization model as the framework. We proposed that we would create a database that was specific to the region, but they were concerned that why are you the mathematical formulation somehow should be different for a developing country, and that's not true. It's just that you're going to have different challenges when you're parameterizing the models, and the data issue is a big one. And it's not just I think the two things that Lauren and Haewon brought up is, one, we don't have good data of existing issues, but also how do you predict demand for electricity in countries that have only 30% access to electricity, and the economic development is going to be completely different. So you're trying to model data that doesn't exist. It's not just that we can't access it, it's that it doesn't exist. So I think the difference is really in the challenges we face doing this type of work.
Okay, great, thank you.
One more thing.
Yeah.
And just let's also keep in mind that developing countries is a very broad term. And so within developing countries, the challenges are very different. I mentioned, I had a student working on with the Brazilian energy system, and he's Brazilian, speaks Portuguese, and the amount of data that he was able to get access to was remarkable. But if you're working in an African country, the data aren't there. So that's very different also within developing countries or across developing countries.
Yeah, no, that's great. Maybe I'll jump to that. That was a question that actually came up on an earlier Twitter feed, right? About kind of what are the similarities and differences? So what can you transfer from modeling one country to another, and what can't you? And so I don't know if Haewon and Lauren, you kind of thought about that, where have you been successful, and then can you use that for a certain set of developing countries, or what have you learned from one place that you can apply to another? Any thoughts about that?
I'm sure there are lessons learned that's applicable, and one benefit of not being the first out there, not being the first country to go to net zero. I guess there aren't that many yet, and not being the first ones to lock into coal and then build a gas bridge and then decarbonize afterwards. Not being the first has advantage in that you can learn from the previous mistakes. You can learn from previous inefficiencies in the pathway towards deep decarbonization. So that's the easy part. But the hard part is that because you're on the uphill side of the growth, the rapid growth part, you need to reconcile the need for growth and need for access to energy, need for access to clean water, food, and whatnot. At the same time, starting to bend the curve in terms of emission reduction. So satisfying both of those is quite difficult. Lauren?
Yeah, I think as has already rightly been pointed out, developing countries is a very broad term, and really there are some big differences. And what's already come up is the issue of access. If you're looking at a country with very low access rates, you can ask yourself the question: is decarbonization really what you should be modeling? Or are there more important energy questions to be answered first? And how do you at least answer those questions first while thinking about avoiding lock-in? But then there's countries on the other side of the spectrum which really are quite large emitters. And there are some large emitters that are large emitters because they are producing oil and gas that is consumed in other countries. That's a really different modeling challenge. And then there are countries that are big consumers of coal. It's kind of a different modeling challenge. And those major emitters, even if they're developing countries, if they're significant emitters and it's from their own consumption, those I would say are in my experience, at least in modeling the power system, are most similar to what you would think about in Europe or the US or other, highly developed countries. And part of that is, part of that's kind of new. It's now that, the international community is coming behind 1.5 degrees. That's such a stringent and challenging target to reach that if you are a significant emitter, there may be no opportunity for you to grow emissions. So it's a very different, even in this equity conversation, surely, common but differentiated responsibilities is important. And there are certainly countries that I think can make strong arguments that they should be able to continue to grow their emissions. But I don't think that line is drawn between developed countries and developing countries. I think there's certainly a number of developing countries that to achieve 1.5 degrees really need to act in the same kind of dramatic fashion that we see in the developed world.
Great. I'm going to go to a question from the Q&A, which is saying, here, I'll just make it directly, is the concept of developed countries through international organizations creating models and potentially policies and energy guidelines for developing countries, is this kind of a newer form of colonialism? So just some kind of comments on who's doing the modeling, what it's used for, is this appropriate? I don't know if you want to try to address that. I know, Paulina, yeah, thank you.
So I think we have to be careful about how we build these models and what we do with them. If we're using these models and saying this is what developing countries have to do and just like that's not useful. I think there are ways where people in the US or researchers in the US and international organizations can still help and develop these models without it imposing things to the countries. One thing that I'm very proud of is that we are working, in my group, we're working with PhD students from the regions to do this work. CMU, like I said, has a campus in Africa, a physical campus with a program in Africa, and several of the students that went through the master programs have now come to do pursue PhD degrees in this area. Several of those students are actually in the participant list I saw, with the goal that they get this knowledge, they get these skills, and then go back and apply these in their context. And the other thing is you have to participate, you have to communicate with the people on the ground, not be assumptions. There has to be a participatory process, even if it's just presenting the results and getting feedback on these models. And finally, I think we also need to be careful about what these models can do for us, right? They are not forecasts, they're not predictions, they are not, they should not be prescriptive. They do not provide prescriptive solutions. They're good for doing what if analyses, what if we do this, what could happen with these, and we need to do better at communicating and helping people broadly, but in developing countries, understand the uncertainties. So I think if we see it as these models are producing results and we're in them in developing countries, yeah, that can be a form of colonialism, but more.
All right, thank you. Paulina, your internet may be slightly unstable, I'm getting in and out. Haewon, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, this is my answer for the next Erin's question that I had written down on my punchline is don't be an imperialist. When you're doing net zero deep decarbonization modeling in developing countries, when you're going into countries, don't be an imperialist. A lot of times it works like a fly-by-night operation. You bring in a model, you know, everyone has their favorite model, and you do the analysis, publish a report, and then you skip town. And I'm not personally free from this problem either. I have my sins in the past as well, but that's not really going to solve the problem. That's not really going to help them. What we really need to do is build something durable and something that has longevity inside a country. So you need the domestic capacity building. You need the universities, think tanks, government agencies that inside the government that they can continue to maintain and they can continue to inform the policymaking through a robust modeling of energy, emissions, and climate and whatnot. So building the capacity building as well as getting the buy-in from local stakeholders is really the key to success, as opposed to, you know, bring a model and then publish a flashy report and move on to the next country. That's just not enough. And I really think the emphasis on building local capacity, like what Paulina said, and, you know, having, whether it be a PhD student or partnership with the local universities, I think those are the key to, you know, having a meaningful impact going down the road and actually achieving deep decarbonization and net zero and 1.5 degree future.
All right, thanks. Lauren, do you want to add anything to this from your perspective a little bit?
Just strong agreement. Having local modelers, there's nothing as good as that. And certainly it's really important to be able to engage a wide variety of stakeholders actually in model results and understanding them. And, you know, Paulina's point as well, you know, it's about showing them a variety of options. It's not to say this is the way, but these are the implications of these decisions. And these are the implications of these decisions. And really, you know, I think modeling, it is a bit up to modelers that are engaging in this to frame their work where their results are not the answers, but their results are tailored in a way that can provide insights and help build the intuition of decision makers about certain trade-offs that are being faced, so that they can move forward with good decisions.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A. So this question was aimed at Lauren, but I think it actually is relevant for the panelists about kind of, you know, are we using the right tools, you know, especially kind of macroeconomic models that are based on neoclassical growth modeling. You know, there's big questions on how energy sources actually shift and different kinds of feedbacks. So I guess, I don't know if Lauren, if you want to start by kind of saying, what is the World Bank using? But then I think, Paulina, I mean, you kind of touched on this earlier when you were saying, you know, are the mathematical equations the same or are they different for developing countries? So maybe we can go from Lauren to Paulina and then maybe Haewon.
Thanks so much. Yeah, maybe it's my bias as a modeler, but there's never a model that I don't like. I think what's important and when models are often misused is because they're being used to answer a question that they shouldn't be answering. So I certainly wouldn't, you know, the World Bank uses a variety of tools, very, very many models. And sometimes we have to defend that to our management. Why are there multiple models? Why couldn't we be more efficient if we just had one? But I think we have it exactly because certain assumptions are okay to make in when you're answering certain questions, and then other questions, you know, those assumptions are really going to undermine what you're trying to answer. And so it's a lot of extra work. It's a lot of work in, you know, creating and maintaining those models. It's a lot of work in communicating those models and their results. But I really think that's the only way forward is to use these as tools and not as magic 8 balls.
Anybody else want to talk about the tools that we use and assumptions? And
I think GCAM is a great model and Magic 8 Ball as well. That's not the point I was trying to make. Similar in the line of thinking in terms of, you know, don't be an imperialist when you're modeling deep decarbonization, because you need a local buy-in and develop it domestically. I try to be as much as my love for GCAM and GCAM modeling, I try not to push model too much, right? It's not a model pushing. It's that, hey, it's an open source model and there's a lot of options out there. And for one reason or another, one type of model fits better for the domestic modelers, we would support that, right? And even if we have differences in opinion, which modeling methodology is better or worse, which equations should we use? Should it be linear, nonlinear, mixed integer, whatnot? But it's much more important to me is, not being an imperialist and having a domestic model that they can maintain over time, and that can be used after generations of graduate students, researchers and whatnot, and that can inform the policymaking more so. So I think because our deep decarbonization research many decades so far, at least one decade so far, has shown that there's a strong agreement on really how to get there, right? Decarbonization of electricity and electrifying a lot of things, non-CO2s and whatnot. Because there's a strong agreement and a lot of models have reached some sort of broad consensus on this, I'm not too concerned about choice of the models. I think it's more important that when the domestic modelers have their best choice of model, I think it, as an advisory role, it is our role to support it and make sure that they get the best use out of the models.
Great, Paulina, do you have any other comments on this, or?
I will be repeating, so I think we can move on.
Good, okay. Great. So I think I'm going to go to the chat and ask, a question of how do we reconcile economic development with net zero pathways, and kind of, what do you, how does this in your models, how are you thinking about this? And again, it comes to these kind of almost ethical questions of what questions are we asking? Go ahead, Paulina.
So I think increasingly this is a false choice of net zero or economic development. I think I hypothesize, and this is in the context of Africa, that what's expensive is building the infrastructure to meet the energy needs for development, and not just the energy needed for households like basic energy service tier 1 or tier 2, but energy that will support expansive human well-being. And so building that infrastructure, that's very expensive. I think building that infrastructure, or I hypothesize that building that infrastructure so that it is low carbon, the marginal cost is decreasing rapidly. And so that we are no one foresaw the reductions in cost of solar that have happened in the last 10 years, or the improvements in storage that have happened in the last 5 years and continue to happen. So I think that is increasingly a false choice. And I think this is where energy modeling could be really helpful, to show that this is not an either or, right? To show what is actually the marginal cost of building for low carbon. And I think that would be super useful also for negotiations, because I think the equity issue is more about who pays than should we. And so I think that's
great. Okay, Haewon, and what's your?
Actually, no one foresaw that solar cost is going to come down so fast. Statement is actually not true. Actually, Erin has a paper from 10 years ago, the first paper that said that consider the possibility of solar ever going down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. For wrong reason, but that was the first paper that said, hey, let's consider the possibility. What if solar was 3 cents per kilowatt hour? And I thought that was a very influential research. Also not the point I'm trying to make. The point is that we're living in a very different space, like Paulina said. If we were just 10 years ago looking at 12-cent solar, then yes, there is a dichotomy. Are you going to use really expensive energy to get to net zero? Or are you going to use fossil fuels to use cheap fossil fuels to develop your economy? But so much has changed, especially in solar, wind, renewable energy, and then soon coming in is electric cars. And it also has air pollution implications. You can grow your economy with much less air pollution now, right? And it's going to accelerate even going more forward. So actually, accidentally, I think we got lucky. We're lucky sitting in 2021, aside from the pandemic. Otherwise, we're lucky in that there is a new path. Without completely ruining your economy, you can actually have a growth path at the same time have low emissions. Now, zero emission, like I mentioned earlier, is very hard. But setting zero aside for a moment, a deep decarbonization at 90% and 80% level, I think we're going to see much more feasible path that marries both the growth as well as the low emission pathways.
Thank you, Lauren. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, so certainly at the World Bank, this is a question we ask ourselves every morning when we wake up, and we are thinking about how do we use existing modeling tools to try and answer these questions and have insights in this so we can advise our client countries. And maybe just connecting again what has already been said. One way we do this is to try and use more robust decision-making strategies. So using models to see what kinds of policies and what kinds of investments are no regret. So we can't predict what technology change will bring us and how that might result in cost reductions, but we can identify actions that governments can take today that will set them up for different futures, however they might evolve, so that they are able to take advantage of those win-win options. Maybe a little less cheery than that, we also try and use models to understand what's the cost of non-action, because I think it's a little bit of it's an easy myth to feel like the costs are only for action, and to compare the cost of action to zero, to no cost at all. But really, that's not the reality that we live in, and you really should be comparing the cost of action to the cost of inaction, which is both climate impact, but also climate policy. We're seeing, as Europe is making decisions about their carbon border adjustment mechanism, their trading partners are having to think very carefully about their own development models and how they depend on exports to Europe, and what decarbonizing their own economy means for supporting the rest of their trade growth. So lots of ways I think that modeling can inform these questions, and just have to take them one by one.
Just to the point about the cost of inaction, I think that's even harder. I think modeling the cost of action is way easier than modeling the cost of inaction on climate change. I would argue that some of those costs are unquantifiable or unknowable. So I know that there's a lot of discussion about social costs of carbon, and we probably shouldn't want to get there, but I would like to know from the economists, how do you value mass extinction events in the social cost of carbon? But anyway, so I think that part is super important also, and I think even harder.
Yeah, great. Yeah, certainly the large scale ones. I think it is interesting to think about the cost of inaction in individual countries in terms of resilience, and in terms of not building their infrastructure in one way and not the other way. I think is quite interesting. So now I'm going to switch gears to another question in the Q&A, which is getting maybe a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of something I'm interested in, which is, can you shed light on how technology kind of uptake, technology adoption, technology competition is represented in models in developing countries, especially? He notices, yes, says Paulina, especially like optimization models, especially if they're least cost, then their only cost is the reason that it gets adopted, but sometimes there's other issues. So if you guys could comment on, again, should it be different in developing countries? How is it different? What would be the best way of modeling technology uptake?
So because that talked to me directly, I'll take the lead. So I think that's what the output of the model is, not the end result. And so I actually think that least cost optimization models are very useful in that they create a good idea of what could be cost effective and possible and technically possible. The more constraints you add to those models, the least you get out of them, because you're just then forcing them to get the answer you want. So the way I see is the least cost optimization can then help us identify, okay, what might be constraints on the social systems to deploying these systems? What might be like interventions that could facilitate or prevent the deployment of these systems? Are there things that we could do if the least cost optimization says the answer is these, but we look at the other impacts, right? The least cost optimization is just kind of the starting point. You then want to also look at the impacts of those pathways and then understand what the trade-offs are. And as an energy modeler, I wouldn't say you should accept this trade-off over this one, but you should present that information. So I think it's just about being very careful in understanding what the use of the model is, what the purpose of the model, and that the number you get at the end is not, that's it, I'm done.
Yeah, definitely a theme, I think, on the communication, right? So we run these models, how are we communicating what comes out of the models? And I think that's where a lot of the kind of confusion can be.
And how do you evaluate what comes out of that model?
Right, yeah, nice. Okay, Haewon, so what are your...
Yeah, I'm going to make an interjection that sends the ball to Lauren's court in a bit. So the modeling, like the cost optimization modeling community has some certain way of modeling things, but we're just scratching the surface in terms of modeling the institutions. The part about not being an imperialist, going back to the former theme, there's one part that we can be not an imperialist, but actually going in to help them do more faster adoption or more efficient adoption, because a lot of times a lot of these new technologies are cost effective in terms of economic costs, financial costs, as well as air pollution impacts and whatnot, but they just couldn't go into the adoption because of lack of institutions or inefficient institutions. And I think that's where we can come in and help them. And by we, I mean World Bank can come in and help them to help get through that institutional barrier, when there's already an economic case to be made that this is a good thing for the development. And that's how I have passed the ball to Lauren.
Yeah, thanks. Haewon, what I like about your comment is, again, you're thinking about how to use modeling results to help build the intuition and understanding of decision makers. And that is, after all, why I think most people are in this game. It's not just to write papers, but because they hope that it's going to influence the decisions that are made. So maybe just even on the question itself, what it made me think of was just, again, the right choice of models. I mean, I think part of this macro energy systems group is saying there are a lot of models out there that all are useful for kind of informing these important questions, and certainly decarbonization among them. So, I mean, I just reading that question when I saw it in the Q&A, I was thinking about, kind of agent-based models. We don't see a lot of those, and maybe more and more we need to think about those models. And certainly you might parameterize them differently for a developing country than a developed country, but probably the model structure is quite similar. And the other thing I thought about is, multi-criteria decision making. So there's, modeling philosophies out there that do realize that least cost isn't the only reason that certain choices are made. And so I think those are again tools that can be used, or approaches that can be integrated into tools that maybe are more traditional in this space. To again, it's not about the number that comes out, but how you interpret that, and then how you relate that to the options that decision makers have to change things or intervene in the system.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator. I'm going to ask a question that I'm interested in, that I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. And it's about, I don't know if tension is quite the right word, but kind of a tension between inter-country justice, international justice, and national justice, so justice within countries. And I don't know if you've thought about it. One example came from Arvind Ravi Kumar at UT Austin, who pointed out that direct air capture, it might be kind of equitable from an international perspective if the developed countries are kind of paying for this and it takes a little bit of pressure off developing countries. But from an intranational, like in the US, it can be seen as not a good thing because it keeps the kind of highly polluting plants in kind of low income areas. That's just a specific example. But I'm just curious of, how kind of macro energy systems, research in macro energy systems modeling can address this, or can think about it, or can be used to think about kind of like international justice versus intranational justice. If anyone has any thoughts on that. Good, Lauren?
I'll start. So we think about this in terms of distributional impact. That's kind of the terminology we use at the World Bank when we think about these issues, and we also think about this issue a lot. And again, to me, it's about what kind of modeling tools are most appropriate for answering those questions. I think there's a lot of opportunity to take some of the geospatial tools that we have. There's actually a lot of population data and kind of interesting income data and things that actually is quite available. That's one area where in the developing world there is actually a lot of information is geospatial. And so creative ways to use that and think about how to map that onto kind of the energy system evolution and think about different impacts. So I think that's a big opportunity. And in macroeconomics, they actually do have a lot of tools to think about distributional impacts of anything. And I don't see those applied a lot in energy models, but I think there's probably an opportunity to in some way bring those together in kind of an interesting way and see what could be informed by that.
Great. Paulina, do you have any thoughts? Because you've done models kind of individual countries, and so I'm guessing you maybe look at our energy justice inside the country as well as maybe internationally.
We're just honestly starting on how do we look at these justice issues, distributional impacts. Some of the challenges are like the spatial and temporal aggregation of the models. And so we have to, some of it is we probably need to build better tools for that kind of analysis. And we've thought about them more in the context of the US, probably because there's more data to start building the frameworks for doing so. So I don't really have a great answer.
Right. No, great, but it's good. I think it's an emerging kind of thing. Go ahead, Haewon. Do you want to come in?
No, I think this is a very difficult problem, and actually it's two very difficult problems. You're almost asking, macroeconomists and microeconomists, can you come up with synthesized, theory of everything that is macro and micro? That's very hard to do. I think we almost do separate the two problems, almost two different tools needed to answer the two questions. On the international space, the mathematical formulation is mostly known. We have a carbon budget. We got to divvy them up, and someone has to pay for something depending on your formulation. Some country does more, some country does less. But broadly, we know that every country needs to go to net zero, and just at different times. And there has to be a financial transfer to allow the feasible transition. That's the international context of it. On the domestic justice is much harder. And this is the part where I think it has to be a domestic modeler coming up with the analysis to inform the policy. This is much harder for an outsider to say, oh, this is unjust. That's much harder to do because we lack the understanding, the depth of it. So to overcome that, I do think as a modeler, the broad modeling community has to provide really good tools for people to use, but not necessarily coming in and saying that this is how you shall do it. But instead, here are the tools that we use in our own countries, and it worked out really well for one reason or another, and it's an open source. So if you want to tweak it and put your own data into it and to use it, giving that opportunity is so far as we can go. That's my perspective.
All right, thank you. So it looks like we have 1 minute or maybe less left. Does anybody, Lauren, Paulina, or Haewon, one more, anything that you didn't get a chance to say yet that you'd really like to let people in the audience know?
I'll just take the opportunity to encourage people to, yes, there's less data, but there's not no data. And there's opportunity for good assumptions and for starting a dialogue and improving the data in that way. So don't give up on decarbonization modeling in developing countries just because of the data issue. Plenty of things to do.
I also think we need to give more credit to the people that are working on these and more resources. When I submit a paper to a journal that looks at something that affects the entire continent of Africa and get a response that it's not generalizable or of wide enough interest, that's very discouraging for the students that are trying to get into these, right? So if you're, especially those of us who are reviewing, think about these. The other thing is like we need resources, right? I heard through Twitter, I found out that the Net Zero America project the budget for that was like $6 million. I can't get $200,000 to do something with a PhD student in East Africa. So if you're in a position where you can push for providing funding for these kind of activities, then do that. And if you're reviewing, acknowledge the value of this work. And get involved in your expertise. It's probably also very useful. So if you can, get involved.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think that our time is up, but thank you very much, panelists. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all those who asked questions. And sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but thank you and join us for the next MES speaker series.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.